What if the strongest faith you have ever seen did not come from kings, prophets, or famous heroes, but from ordinary women, women full of fear, doubts, and limitations? That question unsettles, provokes, and at the same time reveals something powerful. The stories of Sara, Hannah, Ester, Raabe, Noemi, the Shunammite woman, Mary, Marta, Mary Magdalene, and the woman who suffered from an issue of blood show that true transformation begins when someone chooses to trust, even without control over the situation. None of these women had an easy path. Some waited years for a promise. Others risked their own lives. Some faced irreversible losses, and others were marked by silence and rejection. Still, none of them are remembered for the pain they endured, but for the posture they adopted in the midst of it. What united them was not outward strength, but the inner courage to keep moving forward. Each story reveals a kind of faith that still challenges our lives today. Believing when everything seems impossible, acting when fear screams the loudest, remaining when pain tries to paralyze, obeying when there are no guarantees, and testifying after being transformed. These are stories that do more than inspire. They awaken necessary and uncomfortable questions about how we are living our own journey. If you have ever wondered whether it is still possible to live a real, practical, and deep faith amid the pressures of life, this series is for you. And if this message has already spoken to your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you can continue following content that provokes reflection, strengthens spiritual growth, and shows that stories of transformation are still being written every day. The first woman who changed history through faith was Sara, one of the most emblematic figures in the Bible when it comes to promise and waiting. Her biblical story, recorded in the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verses 10 through 14, reveals a promise that completely challenged human logic. At an advanced age, when her body no longer responded, God announced that she would have a son. Faith, in this context, appears as an invitation to trust beyond what the eyes can explain. The Bible does not hide that Sara initially reacted with disbelief, something that makes her biblical story even closer to human reality. In Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 and 2, the text shows that despite her doubt, God remained faithful to His word. Faith was not canceled by laughter, but matured through time. Among the women in the Bible, Sara represents those who learn to believe while they wait. The fulfillment of the promise reveals an essential principle of faith. God acts in perfect timing, not in human anxiety. Sara's biblical story makes it clear that the promise does not depend on physical capability, but on divine faithfulness. The Bible reinforces that what is impossible for humans is merely the ideal setting for God's work. Thus, waiting becomes testimony. Sara's journey teaches that faith does not ignore reality, but refuses to be limited by it. Even in the face of barrenness, the promise remained alive. The Bible shows that God does not cancel His plans because of time or circumstances. Among the women in the Bible, Sara holds a place of prominence precisely because she trusted when everything seemed contrary. The second woman who changed history through faith was Hannah, whose biblical story is recorded in the first book of Samuel, chapter 1, verses 10 through 20. Unlike Sara, Hannah did not receive a direct promise before the answer, but she carried deep pain in her heart. Her barrenness was accompanied by humiliation and constant suffering. Even so, Hannah's faith found expression in persistent prayer. The Bible describes Hannah pouring out her soul before God, without elaborate speeches, only with a broken heart. Her biblical story reveals that faith can manifest itself in silence and tears. Hannah does not bargain with God out of despair, but entrusts her pain with confidence. Among the women in the Bible, she teaches that praying is fully trusting in God's response. Even before seeing any change, Hannah leaves that moment of prayer transformed. The Bible highlights that her countenance was no longer the same. Faith produced rest, even before the miracle. This part of the biblical story shows that trusting God is not only about waiting for the outcome, but about resting while waiting. When Samuel is born, the answer comes in an even deeper way than Hannah imagined. In faithfulness, she returns her son to the Lord, showing that her faith was not conditioned on possession but on obedience. The Bible reveals that God honors those who trust fully. Thus, Hannah becomes a reference among the women in the Bible who surrendered everything without reservation. Both Sara and Hannah lived through long seasons of waiting, but their biblical stories show that faith is strengthened in the process. The Bible weaves these narratives together to teach that God works both in promise and in persistent prayer. In both cases, the answer came at the right time. No tear was ignored. No promise was forgotten. These two women in the Bible make it clear that faith does not depend on age, background, or pain, but on trust in God. Their biblical stories prepare the heart to understand that when faith matures, it turns into courage. And it is precisely this courage that begins to reveal itself even more intensely in women who had to act, risking everything for God's purpose. Lessons from the topic: faith that believes in the impossible. Faith does not depend on circumstances, but on God's faithfulness revealed in the Bible. God fulfills His promises in perfect timing, as shown in the biblical stories of Sara and Hannah among the women in the Bible. The third woman who changed history through faith was Esther, whose biblical story is recorded in the book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. She was in a position of privilege within the palace, but that position also carried great responsibility. The fate of an entire people was at stake, and silence would mean complicity. Faith, at that moment, demanded a decision that went beyond personal fear. The Bible reveals that Esther understood her position was not the result of chance. Her biblical story shows that God had placed her there for a specific purpose. Faith led her to recognize that avoiding responsibility was not an option. Among the women in the Bible, Esther teaches that living for a greater purpose requires a willingness to act. Before approaching the king, Esther called for a time of fasting and prayer. The Bible teaches that true courage is born from dependence on God. In the book of Esther, chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, she enters the king's presence fully aware of the risk. The biblical story makes it clear that her boldness was grounded in faith, not self-confidence. Esther's action demonstrates that faith does not eliminate danger, but sustains the right decision in the face of it. The Bible shows that God honors those who choose obedience even when the cost is high. Among the women in the Bible, Esther stands out for understanding that preserving lives was more important than preserving privileges. The fourth woman who changed history through faith was Raabe, whose biblical story is recorded in the book of Joshua, chapter 2, verses 1 through 14. Unlike Esther, Raabe lived on the margins of society and carried a past marked by rejection. Even so, her faith led her to recognize the God of Israel as the true Lord. That decision completely transformed her destiny. The Bible reports that Raabe hid the Israelite spies, placing her own life at risk. Her biblical story shows that faith is expressed through concrete actions. She did not merely believe, she acted according to that belief. Among the women in the Bible, Raabe reveals that God uses those who are willing, not those who seem ideal. Raabe declared that she had heard about the deeds of the God of Israel and acknowledged His sovereignty. The Bible teaches that faith can be born through hearing, even before any personal experience. This part of the biblical story reveals that trusting God is a conscious choice. Raabe decided to align her actions with what she had come to believe. In the book of Joshua, chapter 6, verses 22 through 25, the Bible confirms that Raabe was spared when Jericho fell. Her biblical story reveals that faith produces deliverance and transformation. From being excluded, she becomes part of God's people. Among the women in the Bible, Raabe becomes a symbol of redemption. Both Esther and Raabe demonstrated a faith that did not remain hidden. Their biblical stories show that believing requires decisions that involve risk. The Bible connects these narratives to teach that courage is evidence of genuine faith. In different contexts, both chose to act while trusting God. These women in the Bible reveal that God does not choose people based on social status or past history, but on the willingness of the heart. Faith that acts with courage changes destinies and impacts generations. The biblical story prepares the way to understand that, at certain moments, faith must remain firm, even when pain becomes part of the journey. Lessons from the topic: faith that acts with courage. True faith is expressed through courageous actions, as revealed in the Bible. God uses unlikely people to fulfill His purposes, as shown in the biblical stories of Ester and Raabe among the women in the Bible. The fifth woman who changed history through faith was Naomi, whose biblical story is recorded in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verses 20 through 21. Her journey is marked by deep loss, husband, sons, and stability. The Bible does not soften her pain, nor hide her lament. Even so, her story shows that faith can remain alive, even when hope seems to have been taken away. Naomi acknowledges her pain with strong words, yet she does not sever her relationship with God. The biblical story reveals that, even in bitterness, she returns to the place from which she had departed. Faith, in this context, is not expressed through optimistic speeches, but through the decision not to completely walk away. Among the women in the Bible, Naomi teaches that remaining is also an act of faith. The Bible shows that while Naomi could not perceive it, God was working through Ruth. Her biblical story teaches that restoration does not always begin where it is expected. Faith was sustained even when purpose could not be seen. This reveals that God continues to act even when the heart is weary. In the book of Ruth, chapter 4, verses 14 through 17, the Bible reveals Naomi's complete restoration. Pain gives way to joy, and emptiness is filled with a new future. The biblical story teaches that faith that endures through pain does not end in frustration. God transforms loss into new beginnings. The sixth woman who changed history through faith was the Shunammite woman, whose biblical story is recorded in the second book of Kings, chapter 4, verses 8 through 37. She lived a stable life until she was confronted with the sudden loss of her son. The Bible presents a quiet, firm, and determined faith that refuses to accept death as the final word. Even in the face of tragedy, the Shunammite woman does not fall into public despair. The biblical story shows that her faith is expressed through the decision to seek the prophet Elisha. She does not deny the pain, but chooses to act while trusting in God's power. Among the women in the Bible, her posture reveals a faith that moves toward hope. The Bible highlights that the Shunammite woman did not resign herself to loss. Her biblical story teaches that persevering faith refuses to close the story before divine intervention. Her trust was not in circumstances, but in the God who had granted her the child. This active faith opened the door to the miracle. In the second book of Kings, chapter 4, verses 32 through 35, the Bible reports the resurrection of the boy. The biblical story reveals that faith sustained in the midst of pain results in supernatural restoration. What seemed final was reversed by the power of God. Hope overcame mourning. Both Naomi and the Shunammite woman faced profound loss. Their biblical stories show that faith does not prevent pain, but prevents it from having the final word. The Bible connects these narratives to teach that God remains present even in the darkest moments. Divine faithfulness is not canceled by suffering. These women in the Bible reveal that faith that endures through pain prepares the way for restoration. The biblical story shows that after loss, God still writes new chapters. And it is precisely this obedient trust that begins to manifest even more deeply in women who choose to fully submit to God's will. Lessons from the topic: faith that endures in the midst of pain. Pain does not nullify God's plans, as revealed in the Bible. Faith sustains hope even in times of suffering, as shown in the biblical stories of Naomi and the Shunammite woman among the women in the Bible. The seventh woman who changed history through faith was Mary, the mother of Jesus, whose biblical story is recorded in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verse 38. She receives news that completely changes the course of her life. The Bible presents an ordinary young woman facing an extraordinary calling. Her response does not come from full understanding, but from faith that submits to God's will. Mary accepts the divine purpose even without knowing all the consequences. The biblical story shows that her obedience comes before any detailed explanation. Faith, in this context, is expressed through complete trust that God knows what He is doing. Among the women in the Bible, Mary stands out for teaching that obedience is not always about understanding, but about trusting. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 46 through 49, the Bible records Mary's song. Her biblical story reveals a faith aware of God's work throughout generations. Faith is not passive, but acknowledges God's greatness even in simplicity. Mary understands that her obedience carries eternal impact. Mary's posture demonstrates that true faith produces willing submission. The Bible does not present resistance, bargaining, or dominant fear in her response. Her biblical story teaches that obeying God is aligning the heart with divine purpose. Among the women in the Bible, Mary becomes a reference of total surrender. The eighth woman who changed history through faith was Martha, whose biblical story is recorded in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. She appears as someone devoted to service, concerned with doing everything properly. The Bible shows that her faith was active but strained by anxiety. Even so, her journey reveals spiritual growth. In the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verses 21 through 27, the Bible presents Martha facing the death of Lazarus. Her biblical story shows a wounded yet trusting woman. Faith is revealed when she declares belief even without fully understanding Jesus' plan. Martha learns that trusting also involves waiting. Martha's journey reveals that faith must mature between serving and resting. The Bible does not devalue her service, but redirects her focus. Her biblical story teaches that obedience is not only found in action, but also in attentive listening. Among the women in the Bible, Martha represents those who learn to balance work and trust. Even with questions, Martha remains close to Jesus. The biblical story shows that faith does not require emotional perfection, but relational persistence. The Bible highlights that her trust evolves throughout the journey. Martha learns that obedience also means trusting God's timing. Both Mary and Martha express faith in different ways. The biblical story connects these two women to show that God values both silent surrender and active service. The Bible teaches that obedience produces eternal impact when it is rooted in trust in God. These women in the Bible reveal that obedient faith prepares the heart for deep transformation. The biblical story points out that trusting God, whether in serving or waiting, shapes character and strengthens hope. And it is precisely from this obedience that a testimony capable of transforming lives begins to emerge. The ninth woman who changed history through faith was Mary Magdalene, whose biblical story is recorded in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verse 2. The Bible presents a woman deeply marked by oppression and suffering, yet profoundly transformed by her encounter with Jesus. Her story reveals that faith begins when liberation reaches the most wounded areas of life. Mary Magdalene is not known for titles or positions, but for her radical transformation. The biblical story shows that after being set free, she begins to follow Jesus consistently. Faith, in this context, is not limited to a moment, but becomes a way of life. Among the women in the Bible, Mary Magdalene represents those whose past was redefined by grace. In the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 16 through 18, the Bible reveals Mary Magdalene as the first witness of the resurrection. Her biblical story teaches that God entrusts great messages to transformed hearts. Faith that liberates also sends. Her encounter with the risen Christ completely changes her mission. Mary Magdalene's journey shows that true faith produces testimony. The Bible does not record long speeches, but immediate obedience. She announces what she has seen. Her biblical story reveals that those who have been touched by grace do not remain silent. Among the women in the Bible, she becomes a symbol of transformation that generates purpose. The 10th woman who changed history through faith was the woman with the issue of blood, whose biblical story is recorded in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 25 through 34. She had lived for 12 years in continuous suffering, social exclusion, and limitations imposed by her illness. The Bible presents a quiet yet deeply determined faith. Even without visibility or recognition, this woman decides to act. The biblical story shows that her faith is expressed in the conviction that a simple touch of Jesus would be enough. She does not demand public attention. She simply believes. Among the women in the Bible, her story reveals that faith can be simple and still be powerful. The Bible highlights that healing is immediate when she touches Jesus. Her biblical story teaches that active faith breaks physical, emotional, and spiritual barriers. What seemed permanent is interrupted by the power of God. Years of suffering come to an end through a single act of trust. When Jesus calls the woman out of anonymity, he publicly confirms her healing. The biblical story reveals that faith not only heals, but restores dignity. She moves from invisibility to recognition. The Bible shows that God does not heal only the body, but also repositions identity. Both Mary Magdalene and the woman with the issue of blood had their lives profoundly transformed by an encounter with Jesus. Their biblical stories show that faith produces liberation and testimony. The Bible connects these narratives to teach that those reached by grace become carriers of good news. These women in the Bible reveal that faith transforms personal stories into eternal messages. The biblical story points out that a genuine encounter with Jesus never ends in silence. And it is precisely this inner transformation that invites each person to reflect on the real impact of faith in their own journey. As we walk through the Bible and revisit the biblical story of these 10 women, one truth becomes clear. None of them lived a shallow faith. Each one, in her own way, built a life of communion with God, amid impossible promises, risky decisions, deep pain, quiet obedience, and life-changing encounters. The women in the Bible were not chosen for perfection, social status, or human strength, but for hearts willing to trust. Their faith was not theoretical. It was lived out in daily choices and sacrifices. Sara, Hannah, Esther, Raabe, Noemi, the Shunammite woman, Mary, Marta, Mary Magdalene, and the woman with the issue of blood remind us that God relates to real people in real circumstances. Their biblical stories reveal that communion with God does not eliminate challenges, but it transforms the way they are faced. Faith did not spare them from waiting, pain, or fear, but it sustained them until God's purpose was fulfilled. This same kind of relationship with God is still available today. This journey invites each person to reflect. How is your heart positioned before God? The Bible shows that a life of communion begins when the heart turns fully toward Him, just as these women in the Bible did. It is not only about believing in God, but about walking with Him, trusting His timing, obeying His voice, and remaining faithful even when everything seems silent. The faith that transformed their stories can transform lives today. Now, here is the invitation. Which of these 10 women inspires you the most or impresses you the deepest? Which biblical story spoke most powerfully to your heart? Share your answer in the comments, because your reflection may encourage someone else. And if this content helped you grow in faith and see the Bible more deeply, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you can keep learning, reflecting, and strengthening your communion with God through every new message.